With the launch of the PS4 and the Xbox One, it only makes sense to make a list to tie in with the occasion. And one of the best ideas is making a list of the systems that were great right out of the gate, and the ones that had a terrible start. Of course, it might be more fun to not just hear my opinions on this topic, so let's bring in another guest. Alex from GameRoomVids, are you ready?
Okay, it's finally my turn to be in the lists. For all gamers, this is a very exciting time for us as new generations issue in new advancements in the gaming industry. New power, new tech, and usually new IPs. But sometimes we have to remain cautious because hype doesn't always mean it's going to be good. Also, for this list, we have quite a number of, well, how do we put this, unconventional rules, and we encourage you to pay very close attention.
For this list, we didn't really want to bring up the often joked at systems like the Virtual Boy, the Gizmondo, and the Sega add-ons because we feel that those have been made fun of so many times that it's not funny anymore. We also just wanted to focus on the systems made by Nintendo, Sega, Sony, and Microsoft, as those are the ones we have the most experience with. As for what criteria they need to have to be on the great list, it's pretty simple. What we thought about them, what games were available, and how well it sold at the launch. In America, anyway.
As for the terrible side, it's pretty much the same thing, but if there's an interesting story behind it, then it's gonna factor in some points. Bad points, that is.
Alright, let's start it off!
Wait, an Xbox? CJ, I don't think I've ever seen anything from an Xbox system be on your list before. Ever.
I'm giving credit where credit is due. For the first system in the Xbox family to come out, it had a pretty good run. Microsoft had to do a lot in order to compete with Sony and Nintendo, but at the end of the day, they did pretty alright.
Besides packing in a DVD player to compete with the PS2, some of the Xbox launch titles included the arcade game Arctic Thunder, the next installment of the Oddworld series, and of course, the one game that people bought the Xbox for, Halo.
The Xbox ended up selling over 1 million units in the first 3 weeks, which was actually a big deal back then, especially for a $300 console. There was a lot of hype for the new system, and it seemed to live up to them. I mean, it's certainly doing better than what they're doing right now.
There's so much hate around the Xbox One that it's almost unbelievable. Unless, of course, you saw the events that led up to it, in which case it's kind of fun to make fun of them. Who hasn't called them the Xbox done?
See what we're doing here? We're proving that the Xbox had a great launch with all that great hype and games that got people to buy it, compared to their current Xbox One, which was once looked at as cancer to gamers.
Will the Xbox One beat that cancer of screwed up itis? Only if they take their Make It Right medication to recover.
What the? How did? Either it took its Make It Right medication treatment, or someone mistook units sold for units shipped.
Fourth place.
Oh, the irony. Despite its terrible fate, it actually had a great launch. In fact, it was probably the greatest launch Sega ever had. I mean, even the launch date is great. 9/9/99.
It had a poor launch in Japan, but in America, it was a completely different story. Units were flying off of store shelves, customers were basically pounding on the doors screaming that they had to have it. 300,000 units were pre-ordered and over 500,000 systems were sold in the first 2 weeks. They may have sold more if it wasn't for the shortage. That's not too shabby for a $200 system leading us into the 6th generation of consoles.
But of course, the Dreamcast wouldn't even have been able to sell a single unit if it didn't have the games to make it throw down the cash. Some of the more popular titles it had were the arcade classics like Hydro Thunder and Soul Calibur, and of course, Sonic Adventure, which felt like Sonic returning to action after missing in action on the SATURN. Yes, I know there are 3 Sonic games on the SATURN, but the only new one was Sonic R. Which would you rather buy?
It looked like it was the thing to put Sega back in the race after the poor sales of the SATURN. And then the PS2 made it eat its dust. And it's a terrible shame. Despite that, it went on to be remembered by fans as a system that had a very special place in their hearts. Some can't even let it go and think that Sega has been working on a Dreamcast 2 this whole time. Spoiler alert, it's not gonna happen.
The system was so well loved that they actually continued making games for it even after the system was discontinued. It was a nice dream while it lasted for Sega fans. I wonder how many people thought this was only going to be about consoles. We said systems, guys. That can include handhelds. Just want to clear that up.
While Nintendo is still the champ of the handheld division, none of their other launches looked as great as the Game Boy. The most popular titles at launch were Super Mario Land, Tennis, and the big one, Tetris.
2 words. Pack in. It's hard to think what the Game Boy would have been like if it didn't have that one game that just about anyone can play, Tetris.
Tetris pretty much invented the puzzle genre. It was so easy to pick up and play and was very addictive. It was a match made in heaven and only helped solidify the Game Boy's success.
Two other big factors that made the Game Boy outsell the competition was that it was cheaper, being only $70, and the battery life lasted a long time. About 10 hours if I'm not mistaken.
Nintendo held on to that Game Boy name for about 15 years, when it would eventually be outsold by the DS systems. And remember, this is about launches, not just how well the system sold overall.
Also, the DS didn't have that great of a lineup at its launch, whereas the Game Boy left a legacy right at the start. That's legendary status right there.
Second place!
Two Nintendo systems in a row? Well, what did you expect? They are currently the company with the most amount of system launches that is still making consoles and handhelds today.
The NES brought gaming back to life after the video game crash of the early 80s. It's a little difficult to tell how many systems were actually sold at the launch, but it's not hard to tell how big a success it was, and the sites that documented the NES's launch said it was a huge success when it first came out. And the system had Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt. Those alone would sell the system. There are more games obviously like baseball and Excitebike, but I think more people are familiar with those.
Especially since Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt were on the same cartridge. The NES was in a bad spot before it came out since the general public back then was starting to think that games were merely a fad, as mentioned earlier by the gaming crash. So for Nintendo to come into a market that was dying and somehow manage to get itself into nearly every home in America is impressive to say the least.
Whatever system you play, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, PC, Amiga, you owe a thank you to Nintendo for bringing video games back to life.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thanks, Nintendo.
Thanks, Nintendo.
Thank you for helping, Nintendo.
Thanks, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thanks, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thank you very much, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
Thanks, Nintendo.
Thank you, Nintendo.
We all appreciate what you've done for us.
Alright, first place!
3 Nintendo systems in a row? Yeah, we're Nintendo fans, but so what? Can you honestly say the Wii doesn't deserve the top spot?
Let's take a look at the launch titles first. You have Wii Sports as the packing game. Brilliant. Just about anyone could play this game because it's so easy to pick up and play and understand how it works. Hold the controller like a baseball bat. Boxing, tennis, golf, bowling, it all makes sense, I get it. It was truly the game to get people to know how to play with the Wii Remote and what the system brought to the table.
You know you're having a good time when Admiral Akbar hits you a home run. And that's only one game with 5 examples. Nintendo and their third-party partners had a slew of other games ready to help demonstrate how the controller could be used. Excite-Truck was a good way of showing off how racing games could use a controller for driving a vehicle. Okay, it took a little time to get the hang of the controls, but once you got the feel for it, it was incredible!
Want some more examples? How about Rayman Raving Rapids? Lots of different ways to use the Wii Remote in this minigame collection. Pointer, balancing, first-person on-rail shooter, and tire yourself out.
And then there was the one that got Nintendo fans excited, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Sure, the motion controls seemed a bit basic, but having a Zelda game at or within the first year of the launch of a Nintendo system seems to guarantee success for your console. Want more proof? Look at how well the Wind Waker HD is selling the Wii U right now. Okay, it's not the biggest success, but every little bit helps.
Now let's look at how successful it was at the launch. Normally we would count having shortages as a problem, but in the Wii's case, it was both a problem mixed with the fact that they couldn't meet consumer demand. The second they hit store shelves was the same second they sold out. This went on for nearly 2 years!
In conclusion, the Wii had the games to demonstrate what the Wii was going to be like at its launch, and it was so popular that it sold out in America for about 2 years! The only real problem was not being able to get enough controllers, and that shortage that we mentioned earlier. This may have been a bit predictable to some, but we couldn't justify having it anywhere else than at the top spot. And now that we've reached the top, it's time to head for the bottom.
I love these parts, it's so fun to bash on the failures.
Yep, now the real fun begins!
The Sony fans are gonna bash us instead.
Ugh, before you leave that comment telling us we're biased idiots, just listen for a second. We are not hating on the PlayStation 2. The PS2 went on to sell over 150 million units worldwide, making it the best-selling system to date. Not even the Wii or the DS can match those sales. It gave birth to dozens of franchises that fans still treasure to this day. We are not saying the PS2 was a bad system. We're saying its launch wasn't that good.
The only thing that kept the PS2 from getting higher was that it did sell about 500,000 units, which is about 500,000 units less than they wanted to because there were manufacturing problems. And then, of course, there were the games.
For fans of the Tekken, Dead or Alive, or Ridge Racer series, the PS2 was your choice. But those and Time Splitters were the only ones worth looking at, and I'm not interested in any of those games, so I was never interested in the PS2 when it came out. The only reason I'm playing Time Splitters right now is because I found it cheap on Amazon.
A part of the PS2's success was that it was one of the cheapest DVD players at the time.
Don't quote me on this, but I think I remember hearing that people bought a PS2 early in its life just to watch DVDs.
Everyone just wanted to watch The Matrix. But it's true, success wouldn't come until they started getting AAA exclusive titles later on. To sum up, the PS2 sales weren't too bad at the start, but the launch titles is what put it on the list.
I'm sorry, but none of those games would even tempt me to throw down $300. But having a cheap DVD player at the time when DVDs were new was a nice consolation prize.
Fourth place.
See, we're being realistic and fair. The Wii U had nowhere near as successful a launch as the Wii did.
I half agree with this entry. It sold about 400,000 units in its first week, and a number of the games it had, like Batman and Assassin's Creed, were highly acclaimed. That's not bad, but therein lies the problem and why I half agree with it.
Most of the games were not exclusive, and some games like Mass Effect and Batman were already out on other systems. So unless for some odd reason you waited to buy a $350 system for these games instead of buying them on the system you already owned, then I guess your patience paid off.
Yes, I knew it!
Dude, you gotta learn to manage your money better.
Point taken. That's why I'm waiting on some big games and a big price drop on the PS4. So yeah, the Wii U had some big games, but the exclusive games did little to sell the system. Oh, so you love Nintendo Land and New Super Mario Bros. U, huh? Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but can you honestly say that they helped push the system to higher sales? And lastly, there was one big problem Nintendo had and still does: how they marketed it.
There's still some people who think the Wii U is an add-on to the Wii. They don't know it's a brand new system, and honestly, we can't blame them. After all those peripherals the Wii had, and still having the Wii name in the title, it's easy for those who don't get excited for E3 to make that assumption.
I still believe in you, Big N. We went through a drought, then got hit by a flood of games, and there's still plenty of AAA titles coming out in 2014. You may have stumbled when you passed the baton from the Wii to the Wii U, but if you pick yourself up and keep going, well, I honestly don't know if you'll finish first, but you can make a great run.
Wait a minute, I thought you guys said you weren't gonna make fun of consoles like this. Well, the idea was we wanted to focus on the major systems, and the Saturn was actually a major system, and not just an add-on like the Sega CD. And it didn't die within months of its release. And CJ has one.
Well, it's my brother's, actually. The real reason the Saturn is on the list is because of its story. For those who haven't heard it, you might want to sit down for this one. In early 1995, Sega announced the Saturn for the US to come out on September 2nd, which would be known as Saturn Day. Sony would announce the PlayStation to come out just 1 week later. However, at the very first E3, Sega revealed that Saturn Day didn't exist because it was being sold at the very same time they were talking at E3 May 11th, 1995.
Can you imagine that? Think about that for a second. What if Sony went to E3 2013 and said the PS4 was already available? Well, the surprise caught everyone off guard. It came with horrible consequences. They were only able to put it in select retailers, and the ones who didn't get them, like Walmart and KB Toys, were so furious at Sega for letting their competitors get the Saturn that some of them went as far as to remove all Sega products from their stores. Third-party companies who were getting their games ready for the previous Saturn Day date were upset that they couldn't get their games out and get some of that release day action. And sadly, the Saturn would cost $400 while the PlayStation would only cost $300.
Releasing the Saturn early like that would have been a great success if Sega let everyone who was involved with the Saturn in on the surprise, had enough of them to get to nearly every retailer, and didn't cost $100 more than the competition. The launch of the Saturn was pretty much the sole reason why it bombed in America. While it may have been successful in Japan, it would continue to struggle in other regions, and that's why we had to put it on the list, because its launch was an instrument in the company's downfall. To be honest, we could have put this a little higher, but the next two hurt just thinking about them.
Second place.
It still hurts.
There's really not much we could say that would justify us putting this over the Saturn, but this is our list after all, and CJ just can't get over it.
The DS is Nintendo's most successful selling handheld, and the 3DS looked amazing, but sadly it's on the list because of two things. It launched without some of the proper functions like the eShop. And two, what was there to play?
Who wants to throw down $250 to play Nintendogs with glasses free 3D? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone at all?
The titles that were available for it were less than impressive. It was nice to see Pilot Wings again, and Street Fighter 4 looked good, But what were the big games and games that weren't rehashed? The best games to play on the 3DS were your old DS games. The system lacked a killer app and its $250 price tag almost killed itself.
Sales of the 3DS looked bleak. Nintendo, the once dominant force in the handheld department, was having major issues trying to move the 3DS. Nintendo was able to change things up and made the 3DS worth owning later on, but it's their worst launch ever, just barely missing the top spot.
I'm gonna be honest with you guys. There was only one reason we put the PS3 at the top of the terrible list. Would you like to guess that reason?
Is it because it launched at either $500 or $600?
Nope.
Is it because it came with one of the most abysmal launch lineups, with Resistance being the only exception?
Guess again.
Is it because they had 400,000 units at launch, but they missed their quota again and about 40% of their systems didn't show up?
Not even close.
Is it because you hate Sony, CJ?
No, I've actually started to respect them a bit more over the years, and the PS3 has become my favorite PlayStation system. All those reasons combined would have put it tied at a close second to the 3DS. The real reason why it's at the top of the terrible side isn't even Sony's fault. If this had happened during another launch instead of the PS3, then that launch would have instantly taken the #1 spot. And that reason is, someone got shot over one.
What? Are you serious?
Yeah, apparently one guy who wanted to buy about 4 PS3s and sell them on Amazon was in line, and 2 masked and armed teenagers came in and started robbing people in line. I don't want to go too far into details about what happened. All you need to know is the guy survived, and the store, I won't say which one, even gave him a free PS3.
I don't even know what to say about that, despite the irony that you're showing a first-person shooter while talking about this.
I do. I hope those teens were caught, tried as adults, and locked up forever. I remember hearing about this when it happened, and that scared the ever-living crap out of me because the Wii was coming out 2 days after, and I was terrified this might happen. And when the time came, I was first in line outside of Game Crazy, but I noticed there was this guy waiting in a car with a leather jacket, real dark sunglasses, and I can't remember if his hair was in a spiked punk style or not. But believe me, I was starting to worry. Thankfully, more people showed up, and we were all talking about future games and having Nintendo trivia, and when it came time to open the stores, that guy came out of his car and was heading to the back of the line, but I stopped him and said, "Hey, I saw you were here before me, go ahead in front."
Wow, CJ, that's very kind of you.
Because I figured if he really did start robbing people, he wouldn't rob the guy who gave him front of the line cuts.
Wow, CJ, that sounds cowardly of you.
Luckily, they took 2 people in at a time, and because I had everything paid off except for the tax, I was the first one out of that store with the Wii. And with my little story over, I want to say this. I don't care what system you plan on getting this holiday season. I don't care if you get a Wii U, I don't care if you get a PS4, I don't care if you get an Xbox One. What I want for you is to be safe when you get it, and happy when you're playing it. For those of you who had to wait in line to get your PS4 or your Xbox One, I pray nothing bad happened to you. God bless.
May you all be safe and happy with whatever you get. And with that, our list comes to a close.
And if your list is different than ours, then we'd love to hear the 5 system launches that you feel were great and terrible. For the record, this was the only time I've heard that someone was shot over the launch of a system, and I pray that never happens again. And now it's time to end this with video plugs. Up there we have the 5 favorite and hated Sonic characters list with We Do It 83 Rebirth, the redo review of Pikmin 2, the quick 5 I did for my 5 favorite launch titles last year, and... Hey Alex, what video do you want to have plugged?
Why don't you use that top 10 Mario games list that I used for the contest?
Plugged and ready. And with all that, we'll catch you guys next time. Later everyone.